Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. So, I probably waited too long to cover this show, but I decided to just go for it anyway because after watching the full season, I think it's more than deserving of its own video. Oh, and before I get into any of this, there will be full spoilers for the show so far. Anyway, after The Boys Season 2, I made a video focusing on Homelander, so it only feels right that this video take a look at Omni-Man. When looking at these two shows side to side, it's really interesting how well they reflect their comic book creators' feelings on the concept of superheroes. Both start from a premise that if superheroes were real, things would be a lot more brutal and a lot more ugly than they're depicted in the Marvel or DC universe. But Garth Ennis, the writer of the Boys comics, hates superheroes. Kind of with a passion, he's really happy to talk about it. Robert Kirkman, on the other hand, clearly loves them. This show isn't about eviscerating the concept of superheroes, and more about playing with the tropes and expectations that come with over half a century of superhero stories. And Omni-Man is one of the biggest examples of that. In a way, he's kind of the show's calling card. The first indication that while this show may look a bit similar to Justice League Unlimited or a DC animated film, it's playing by entirely different rules. So this week, let's dig into Omni-Man, the father and greatest villain of Where Homelander is a petty, vindictive man who's driven almost purely by his own emotions, kind of like a toddler, Omni-Man is the opposite. He sees himself as serving a noble cause, far more important than him, a galaxy-spanning empire that he's devoted his life to. J.K. Simmons is famous for playing loud, abrasive characters, from Spider-Man to Whiplash. But I love that, at least until the finale of this season, Omni-Man isn't really like that. In many ways, he's very cold and calculating. The first episode ends with the shocking murders of all the Guardians of the Globe, but I don't think Omni-Man really has anything emotionally against them. To him, they were unimportant pawns, used and discarded to set up bigger moves. I think that's why the violence in Invincible, especially in the Omni-Man scenes, never felt unnecessary to me, because by showing it in its full horror, it really underlines just how disconnected he is from human life and how little it bothers him to just brutally kill the people he's called friends. In reality, Omni-Man is everything the young, naive Mark believes that he's becoming a superhero to stop. And in true Robert Kirkman fashion, he has to face up to that fact in an incredibly grueling way. It's a really blunt twist that the show is happy to reveal early on, actually far earlier than the comic book did. But it's not until the finale that we see the full extent of Omni-Man's cruelty. At first blush, Omni-Man seems like a pretty straightforward inverse of the Superman tale, a visitor from a different world coming to Earth to conquer instead of do good. He is a riff on Superman, as Kirkman will freely admit, but I think the show does a good job of fleshing out who he is and what he believes in a way that adds more layers to the character. One scene I found myself thinking about once I had finished the season was his first time training Mark after they discovered his newfound powers, where he basically sucker punches the kid as the young hero is struggling to learn the ropes. It's one of the first times in the series where his true nature comes through around his family, even though it's under the guise of tough love. In retrospect, it's really clear that he was just frustrated with Mark because he was failing, he was doing poorly. And as we see later on, there's no place for that on Viltrum. You excel or you die. Which is why his behavior towards Mark changes so much after he gets his powers. Because he's not a human anymore, Nolan actually expects something from him now. But I feel like it would also be a lie to say that every aspect of Nolan's home life was a put-on or a facade. If that was the case, he would have killed Mark once and for all in the finale, but he can't bring himself to do it. I'll be honest, I've only read the first 6 issues of the comic, and that was a really long time ago. So right now, I'm just enjoying not knowing where this story is going to go from here. And one of the biggest questions I have is about Omni-Man's motivation. Did he spare Mark because humanity had really rubbed off on him? Like a part of him has really become Nolan Grayson, the loving family man? Or is it actually that Mark's potential as a Viltrumite is something that he doesn't want to lose? Maybe he's become so attached to this vision of conquering Earth with his son by his side that he doesn't want to give up on that dream. Even though Mark makes it pretty clear that it probably won't happen. I'm not sure even Omni-Man himself knows the answer, and it's that inner conflict that really elevates the character above what I expected going into the show. Speaking of characters, one that I kept thinking about while watching Invincible was actually Zack Snyder's take on Superman, this alien who is constantly plagued by questions of morality and trying to figure out what he owes humanity. Omni-Man's answer is basically nothing. Yeah, he can talk about how great everything would be for humanity under Viltrumite rule, but it's pretty clear that that's just the empty propaganda of an empire. We learn later that Alan the alien's planet was entirely destroyed for not giving in to their rule, so it's pretty safe to say that the health and future of the planets they conquer isn't exactly near the top of their priority list. One giant bomb that Nolan drops on Mark is the revelation that he's basically immortal. And he tries to use that as a justification for why Mark can and should stop caring about every human he knows. And this method of winning Mark over was always kind of doomed to failure. And the fact that Omni-Man thought this would work makes me believe that he really has learned nothing about humans or how they think, which makes a lot of sense as he clearly isn't very interested in them, even if his son was raised as a human. Saying that he thinks of Mark's mom as more of a pet in a big speech trying to bring him to his side are not the words of someone who understands Mark or what he believes at all. Nolan leaves his son in bloody shambles on the top of a mountain after subjecting him to some of the worst violence Mark has ever seen. It's a brutal sequence, and one that perfectly makes sense for Omni-Man. Of course his way to win Mark over to his side is to beat the shit out of him, because that's how he's always solved pretty much every problem he's ever had. At least on Earth, there's not been very many issues in his life that he couldn't fix by simply existing as the most powerful being on the planet. But winning Mark over is something that all of his power and might can't do, because every punch and brutal murder that he commits is just driving his son farther and farther away. When faced with that, but also unable to put an end to Mark, there was nothing left for him to do but fly away in tears. So far, I've mostly focused on the relationship between Nolan and Mark, but Debbie Grayson is definitely worthy of discussion too, and the season ends in an understandably really dark place for her. We didn't get that much backstory for her and Nolan as a couple, but I think what we do get is well executed. We learn that Debbie's first impression of Nolan was that he was a huge jerk who expected her to be almost worshipful of him right off the bat. First impressions can be wrong a lot of the times, sure, but in this case, her first impression was definitely more correct about who he was than their 20 years of marriage that came after. The cynical reading of their relationship is just that Nolan learned how to fake everything. Love, empathy, compassion, and there's probably quite a bit of truth to that. But seeing him fly into space after everything he had done to Mark, just crying, makes me think that it wasn't totally fake. He can't be that perfect Viltrumite when his family is involved. Unfortunately for Earth though, it seems like those feelings don't extend beyond Mark and maybe Debbie at all, which hopefully will lead us to a great season 2. Back to Mark though, I love the moment where he begins to learn who his dad really is and just can't accept it, assuming that he's been mind controlled. It's solid writing because I think it's kind of operating on two levels. The first is that in a Marvel or DC story, that probably would be the explanation. The good guy turns evil because he's under the control of a villain is a story that's been told 1,000 times. And Mark has kind of gone his whole life believing that he lives in a Marvel-style universe. The other is that it just really shows how much Mark has always looked up to Nolan and the very idea of Omni-Man. His father being evil can't possibly be true, and even up until the very last minute of Nolan murdering a defenseless pilot right in front of his eyes, he's unable to accept it. But eventually, he really has to. One common criticism of superhero comics is that nothing really has stakes because things always have to come back to that status quo eventually. And oftentimes that is true, even if I'm generally willing to just set it aside to read a great story. Invincible really wants to upend that. The stakes are high and things are definitely not returning to any sense of normalcy. Omni-Man started the season appearing to be the Earth's greatest hero and ends it being who he really was all along. A brutal conqueror and the planet's greatest threat. What if Superman was evil is a concept I've seen done plenty of times, including in the pages of DC Comics. But Nolan may be the most compelling version of it I've ever seen on screen, and I can't wait to see what they do with him going forward. So I think we can all agree that none of us are going to be robot anytime soon. But if you are just a little bit jealous of Rudy's problem solving skills, Brilliant is for you. It teaches a huge range of subjects, not by making you memorize formulas and repeating them over and over, but by creating really engaging questions for you to use your critical thinking skills to solve, giving you the tools to learn, but also a really fun challenge. I really like the stats questions. They're challenging, but they also give me a really fun sense of reward, kind of like I'm leveling up in a game. But you don't have to stop there, there's a lot more complex stuff to check out too, helping you learn about everything from neural networks to cryptocurrency. Not to mention, this is a website and app designed around respecting your time, helping you make progress every time you use it, and coming out the other end much more knowledgeable. So to build that knowledge, go to brilliant.org/midnight and try it for free. Oh, and also, the first 200 people to go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.